Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Law News Network. I'm Jesse Weber, and thanks for joining us this morning on Friday. Excuse me, Friday, and the weekend's here. But before we go to the weekend, we have a lot to cover today in many different cases that we are covering here on the Law News Network, as well as some special segments that we have installed for you as well. So just to recap about what we've been covering, we have been covering every day the Luis Toledo trial out of Florida. This is Mr. Toledo is 35 years old. He's charged with second-degree murder in the killing of his wife, Yesenia Suarez, and 2 counts of first-degree murder in the killing of her 2 children, Talia, who is 9, and Michael, who is 8 years old. The bodies of all 3 have never been found, but if he is convicted of killing those children, he faces the death penalty. Yesterday was crucial day in court where we actually saw Mr. Toledo being interviewed by police, his interrogation video. And you know what he did? He admitted to killing Yesenia Suarez in the video, karate chopping her in the throat. She was gasping for air and she died. But it doesn't end right there, because according to him and the defense, he had nothing to do with the death of those 2 children. So he might be responsible for killing his wife, but he says he has nothing to do with the death of his children. So who did this to, and they weren't his children, excuse me, they were her children. So who would have done this? Well, he is pointing the finger at a witness who has testified in this case, Tyshawn Jackson, who is a neighbor of Mr. Toledo. And he said that Mr. Jackson used an axe to kill the 2 children because he was on probation and he didn't want to get in trouble, and he disposed of the bodies. There's a lot to digest with that testimony, with everything that we saw. And a little bit later, I am going to play you this interrogation video, and we're going to analyze it here and talk a little bit about what does this mean for his case moving forward. You see that interrogation video right there, him in his jumpsuit. So we will talk about that case. There's another case that we are covering here on the Law News Network as well. It just started yesterday. It's out of Michigan. It's the case of Jeffrey Willis, who's on trial for the murder of Rebecca Blech. Now, Willis is accused of shooting this woman several times in the head alongside Automobile Road in rural Muskegon County on June 29th, 2014. It is believed that at the time she was jogging, and there's questions about whether or not he tried to get her into his van. And as the prosecution will say, this is part of this was all part of an attempt to kidnap her, rape her, and kill her. They say this is the motive because Mr. Willis has had quite the colorful history. Mr. Willis is charged in the kidnapping and murder of a different woman, Jessica Haringa, who disappeared from her gas station job in April of 2013. Her body has never been found. That's not it. He's also been charged with the abduction of a teenager who was walking along a rural Muskegon County road in April of 2016. She escaped her abductor, and that investigation ultimately led the investigators to Willis in this case. So he is now being charged in connection with 3 separate incidents, and this trial, the one with Rebecca Blech, is the first one up. So much to digest with this case, so much to talk about. It's a some would say very strong circumstantial case against him, circumstantial evidence case. When we get into what was in his van, what was he looking at? This is a guy that has some very peculiar hobbies, but does that make him guilty? Well, the defense is going to point the finger at a family member and say it has nothing to do with Mr. Willis, but somebody else is the responsible for the murder of Rebecca Blech. We're going to talk about that in a little bit later. But in the meantime, I also want to preview some other segments. In a little bit later today, we're going to talk about Harvey Weinstein. I'm sure you've been following what's been going on with him. Well, now there's a question about whether or not his board, the board members of the Weinstein Company, can be sued by the shareholders. We're going to talk about that. We have Seth Berensweg coming in at around 10 a.m. to talk about that. Later on today, Caroline Polizzi as well as Aaron Keller are going to discuss how Florida, there's no mandatory arrest law for domestic violence. That's going to be a very interesting discussion to talk about. But in the meantime, there is a special segment that I want to talk to you about right now. As you know, there was a horrific shooting in Las Vegas that was perpetrated by Stephen Paddock, where over 500 people were injured, 58 people were killed. Now the question becomes, are there lawsuits against MGM Resorts International, the people who were running the venue, the people that were responsible for the machine guns. Now we have to have that conversation because the father of a 28-year-old native of Huntington Beach, California, a woman named Andrea Castilla, she was fatally wounded during a mass shooting at this country music festival in Las Vegas. And her father has filed a lawsuit for wrongful death against the operator of the Mandalay Bay Resort and others. And now we have to talk about, do they have a case? Well, to help me talk a little bit more about this specific issue, I'm here with trial attorney Mark Tate. Mr. Tate, thank you so much for being here on the Law News Network.
Hey, it's my pleasure. Can always count on Law News Network to keep things light and fun on a Friday morning at 9 o'clock.
You know what? We just report what it is. Unfortunately, I wish I had better stories, but this is what is in the news, and I think it's a very important subject. So I just want to start very generally from this case. Can you explain to our viewers what is wrongful death? What does that mean? What is that kind of case?
Sure. Well, wrongful death exists because, and the cause of action exists because of legislative involvement. And before there was such a thing as the Wrongful Death Act, a cause of action would expire upon the death of the person who's injured. And so because that's not really fair or just to somebody who dies because of their injuries, the legislatures in all the states created a Wrongful Death Act that gives a cause of action for the full value of the life to a particular person. Sometimes it's the surviving spouse, sometimes it's the administrator of the estate. And so what has been filed really here, and it creates two causes of action. And in most jurisdictions, what you have is the cause of action for the conscious pain and suffering. And so after a person's injured, they have obviously pain and suffering and incur medical expenses, and that belongs to the estate. And so the estate of the individual who passes away brings the cause of action for the expenses of last illness, burial expenses, punitive damages, pain and suffering. And pain and suffering would include things like the knowledge of impending death, the level of pain that you're enduring, and in this case, obviously, that's going to be, it's going to be horrific. The girl was shot initially at the venue, and they got her to the hospital, and obviously, there's a great deal of pain. And when we talk about pain and suffering, pain is physical pain, and suffering really refers to mental anguish, to the mental anguish that you go through suffering with your injuries and knowledge of what could happen to you, and so that is embodied generally in the estate. And then when someone does pass away, the full value
Sorry about that, everybody. We had a little bit of technical difficulties, but we're back. We're back, and we're here with Mark Tate, and we're talking about the MGM brand and the MGM Resorts and what happened in Las Vegas with that shooting, and particularly the father of a 28-year-old, Andrea Castilla, who is a native of Huntington Beach, California. Her father has filed a wrongful death suit against several industries, and Mr. Tate was just going through what happens in a wrongful death suit. Now I just want to pinpoint, I want to go defendant by defendant and see if they have a case. So the first defendant in this case is MGM Resorts International. Let's talk about that. What is the theory to go against MGM Resorts International here?
Well, obviously, one of the touchstones of any principle of liability is reasonableness, and the question here would be whether it's reasonable for MGM Resorts International running Mandalay Bay to have not done a wellness check on someone who's been in their room for a period of, I think it was 4 days, although the story changes, I think, without finding out what's going on in there. And also the notion would be that he carried so much equipment up there that something should have alerted them that there's something wrong. And if you remember, Steve Wynn of Wynn Resorts said very shortly after this that if there had been someone in one of their rooms for that period of time without letting people in who are staff members of the hotel, that would have set off alarms and they would have done a wellness check. I think that that's sort of one of the first things that I thought, thinking about the kind of liability that could exist for the folks involved in this. Obviously, MGM Resorts is in the business of running high-end, very nice casino hotels, and it seems to me that they should have a level of security commensurate with the level of service that they're providing. And one of the things that's very surprising to me is, you know, Las Vegas is one of the most securitized towns probably on earth. You know, they have people who watch everything that happens all the time, and then they have security guards who watch the security guards. It is very, very controlled, and there's video cameras everywhere. And it seems to me that they have some answering to do for how this man was able to get so much equipment into that room and stay for so long without having any checks on him. Obviously, it's a hard case of liability. This lawyer who's filed this lawsuit has a very tough row to hoe in trying to prove all this. But there's going to be a lot of evidence. There's going to be a lot of video evidence. There's going to be a lot of reviewing of their security standards. There'll be reviews of what housekeeping standards are. And he's going to have a lot of documents to wade through and a lot of depositions to take to prove the liability against MGM. And I respect him for trying it. And obviously the father of this young lady is in for a long ride as well. I'm not sure whether California is the best venue, but we can talk about that as we go through the rest of the defendants.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that a little bit later, but I want to, let's stick with MGM Resorts International, which, as you said, operates the Mandalay Bay. Right. What about the idea that they should have reacted sooner once they heard the gunfire? They should have sent security up there immediately. Remember, if I'm correct, the reason they were alerted, besides the gunfire, was the smoke in the room, and the fire detectors went off. Shouldn't they have responded sooner?
You know, I think that's one of the a great argument. Obviously, intervening criminal acts of third parties generally immunize a landlord or a property owner from civil liability. But in this instance, the question is there such an exigent circumstance that they should have responded sooner? That's where the whole timeline comes into question. And as you know, it's shifted. First it was a few minutes that the security guard approached 6 minutes before he approached 6 minutes before the firing started, and then he approached after the firing started. And so again, it's going to be a really fact-specific inquiry to find out whether they could have or should have done more. I sort of think if you wind up going down the road of did the hotel react quick enough once this man had loaded weapons and was going to start shooting, I think that's going to be very difficult. But I really think focusing on the security measures in place, or should be in place reasonably, to detect such problems, I think that's probably going to be a better focus. I'm not saying I would ignore whether the response was rapid enough, but when you start trying to point a finger and say, hey, you didn't act quickly enough. I think that might repel a juror. I think that might make people think, well, listen, they're responding to a clear emergency, and they did the best they could under confusing circumstances. I really think that the focus should be on prevention and what they should have done as this man was checking in and hauling, I think it was 23 guns, big, large. I mean, it's heavy-duty weaponry and heavy-duty, ammunition into his room. It just seems to me strange, although I thought it was interesting that the man's brother commented, how do you get guns in your room? You tip the valet $100 and he takes anything up there. Well, we'll find out about that.
Well, I mean, that does raise the larger question of whether or not these hotels should have some sort of metal detectors for suitcases, x-ray machines moving forward. That's a separate conversation. But, okay, we talked about MGM Resorts International. The concert promoter, Live Nation, has also been named in the suit. Now, it's my understanding they're naming them because of the way the concert venue was set up, but also because they put the lights on at a specific time, it gave Mr. Paddock the ability to see his victims. What do you think about that?
I would not have filed that lawsuit. And one of my
not have named them as a defendant in this case.
I wouldn't have. I mean, I think that's a shotgun approach, and not being critical of the lawyer. He had his own reasons for doing that. But it seems to me the concert promoter is really a helpless victim just as much as the young lady. Except, of course, you can't kill a promoter that way. But the thing is that I don't see how on God's green earth they could have done anything to make a venue for a concert safe from this man's intentional act. I really think it comes down to the hotel and then whoever we can go after for supplying this large quantity of ammunition and the gun stocks.
Right.
But I really just don't see how. Well, like I said, if it had been my case, if Miss Casilla had come to me, I don't think I would name the concert promoter. I think they might be a better ally for you in the litigation and pointing the finger at the hotel.
Because isn't the idea that they were out in the open and you're really just protecting from people coming into the venue? It's hard to protect from external threats?
I mean, I don't know how you can. You're going to say they lighted the venue and so that gave a sniper an opportunity to shoot guests? I don't see that. What they're doing is they're controlling access of people on foot. This has never happened before. We've never had a sniper firing into a venue before, except I guess at University of Texas years ago. But we've have not had a music venue attacked by a sniper with high-powered sniper rifles. So I don't know how a concert promoter could possibly have reasonably anticipated that this could happen, and then therefore guard. How do you guard against this? Put a dome over it? I don't know. I just think that accusing them of having improper exits or lighting the victims at the wrong time, I just don't see it. And by the way, you don't need lighting in order to shoot these people. He had plenty of equipment. He could have used night vision goggles to see his victims. I just don't. I'm having a hard time with that theory.
Okay, so we have a stronger case against the MGM Resorts International and less against Live Nation. The next defendant that's named is Slide Fire Solutions, who's the manufacturer of a gun accessory called a bump stock that allows semi-automatic weapons to mimic the fire of a machine gun. I think we need some clarification about why they're named a defendant, because if I'm understanding this correctly, couldn't you just say that they can't be responsible what people do with their product? Isn't that the way to explain it, or am I missing something here?
Well, I think that's a difficult case as well, because unfortunately their product is legal. But it's kind of like cigarettes. I mean, this is a product that when used as intended by the manufacturer will kill. And it's designed to turn a semi-automatic rifle into an automatic rifle with those types of characteristics. So you're skirting the law against ownership of automatic rifles without certain class of federal permits. I think it's a difficult case. I would have definitely brought that case because it's really, I think that's some social engineering lawsuit, social engineering litigation. And the question is, should a company who creates a device that takes a legal product and turns it illegal be responsible for the outcome of that illegal product. And I think that, again, I don't know if California is the place to file this, but I think it's a good piece of litigation that should be brought, and it may have the effect of changing the entire industry of making these workarounds and turning turning semi-automatic weapons automatic. So I think that's a good case. But again, California is a tough jurisdiction. They've done away with a number of things that generally help the victims of tortious conduct. One of those things that used to be universal was joint and several liability. And joint and several liability is the theory that when two parties act in concert and cause an individual inseparable harm, that they are jointly and severally liable for the liability, meaning that they acted together, that's the joint part, but they also acted independently, that's the several part. And the reason that makes a difference is because the person most answerable in damages, that is the person who's got the money, can wind up paying the entire verdict. I know that MGM Resorts International has a location in Maryland, and it's obviously on the other side of the coast, much further away from Vegas. But I would want to explore whether we could get jurisdiction and venue over MGM in Maryland, because Maryland, unlike many states, still has joint and several liability. And if you remember, we had this sweeping notion that there had to be tort reform, which was really just, frankly, a campaign fundraising tool for Karl Rove and his party. And
Right.
so what they did is they said, we need tort reform. We need to beat down the trial lawyers. Part of this notion of tort reform was getting rid of joint and several liability.
But Mr. Tate, isn't that, if they go after them in another state, how would that work? Because all this happened in Vegas, so how would they be able to attach, even if the MGM, I know MGM has properties in Michigan, they have properties in other states, why go after them in another state?
Well, I'm just saying, if you can get jurisdiction over them in a state that has maintained joint and several liability, you have a better chance at holding all those defendants in. California has a different type of liability structure, and it may be more difficult to hold all of them in. I just think, and my overall point is that I think you have to carefully consider, this is a huge piece of litigation. There are going to be many, many other lawsuits filed. Obviously, there are 49, 50 people who have died, many, many, many people who are seriously injured. There can be a lot of lawsuits filed. This is going to be in-depth, lengthy litigation.
Yeah.
I think it's important to figure out where the best place to file is.
We're going to talk about that because I want to talk about the other cases that might be filed, but I do want to talk about another defendant in this case. The estate of Stephen Paddock has been named as a defendant. Now, I have to ask you about this one because my understanding is, look, usually what happens, or the way that I've seen wrongful death happen, is if you have a defendant who was on trial in a criminal case, and whether they're found guilty or not, the family, you can sue them for wrongful death if they have deep pockets and say, despite what's found in the criminal trial, there's a different standard for wrongful death. We can still sue you for money for causing the death of our loved one. Now, here's the problem. The estate of Stephen Paddock, how does that work? I mean, and how does that work when the victim, when the supposed defender, the perpetrator of this crime is dead? How would that work?
Well, I've handled those kinds of cases myself in the past, and essentially the family, in order to get his assets, has to create an estate. If they don't, then you can petition the county in which he resided to essentially appoint a county administrator to be the administrator of his estate. And all of his assets will be pooled into that estate. If you remember, we've heard he's got a large amount of cash. He says he gambled up to $1 million a night.
Deep pockets.
Yeah, he's got some money. Not a lot, but as compared to MGM, but he's got some money that he can pay pay in damages. So you would create an estate and sue that estate, and it would pool all of the assets, and you could go after that. But you're exactly right, because the criminal justice system is completely different from the civil justice system. And obviously this man will never be tried. But if you remember in the O.J. Simpson matter, O.J. was acquitted in the criminal case. But the families of Jeffrey Goldman and Nicole Brown filed a lawsuit in civil court against O.J. Simpson, where he got a judgment against him and he had to pay it.
I think it was $33.3 million or something around that number, right?
Right, right. I think it would be a whole lot more today because that's 25-year-old money now at this point.
Right.
But yeah, that's exactly right. And the standard, of course, is different. And I know you know it, and probably most of the people who tune into LawNewz at 9 a.m. on a Friday know it. But in order to convict somebody in criminal court and criminal justice system, you got to prove their guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And that sounds like a really difficult standard, but really all it means is you have to have a reason, a sensible reason to have doubt about guilt. That's all that means. And so in the civil justice system, it's preponderance of the evidence, which means a feather's weight. If the plaintiff tips the scale just a feather's weight in the favor of the plaintiff, then the plaintiff prevails and the judge will charge you. It's a feather's weight of evidence.
I want to tackle that point right there while I have you on it. So the idea that I understand with preponderance of the evidence, we're talking about a different standard in wrongful death. It needs to show at least 50% of the evidence points to somebody saying they're the cause of someone's death. So how is it possible that when you have a criminal trial and you can have certain evidence showing, okay, it points towards somebody, but you can't show it's beyond a reasonable doubt, but here that's more than 50%. Am I looking at this differently and say that some evidence can be introduced in this civil case that might not be able to be introduced in this criminal case? Can you tap on that a little bit?
I mean, obviously, the rules of evidence apply equally in criminal cases as they do in civil cases, but you're absolutely right. There is some evidence that would tend to weigh more heavily for a plaintiff in a civil case that may not come in a criminal case. The judge may exclude certain circumstantial evidence. He may exclude things as drawing an improper conclusion. There may be some experts that can testify in a civil case that can actually speak to the final conclusion of the jury, and that can't happen in a criminal case. So we may have forensic experts or ballistics experts, for example, that can show that it's more likely than not that a particular piece of ammunition was used by a defendant that the judge in a criminal case may say is not sufficiently sound to let in. There are different standards. There's the old Fry evidence test where it's just isn't generally accepted in the community. And then there's a far more stringent federal test called Daubert, which comes from a Daubert versus Merrill Dow pharmaceutical case from the Supreme Court that made it very difficult to get some essentially questionable expert opinion.
You're reminding me of my law school days right now, these standards. Sorry. So it's bringing back memories.
Do that to you.
I just from a general standard, I know this is not an entirely fair question, but obviously, thank goodness we haven't had these kinds of situations happen a ton. But in cases like this where there are multiple defendants and there is a tragedy where so many people are either hurt or killed, do you see wrongful death cases like this? Are they usually successful?
Well, when the victims hire me, they are.
Good answer. Great answer. Good answer. I hope everyone here on LawNewz heard that.
We have a case starting Friday, and unfortunately here there were two young girls who were kidnapped and raped at their college campus, and they survived. But we're going to trial against essentially the owners of the apartment complex where the girls were raped, and you can see the assailant on videotape wandering the campus with a pistol in his hand. He's seen on 17 different cameras. One of the people who's testifying for us is the former chief of police of the college campus, who said, while I was there, I had my cameras monitored 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and I had a security guard there actually on premise from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. And so those are the types of pieces of, and when he quit. The college campus discontinued 24-hour monitoring. This unfortunately happens to be at a campus who at the time had been found to be, by a particular publication, to be the second most dangerous college campus in America. And so he left the campus to go be chief of police up in Clayton County, Georgia. And the campus discontinued all of that, and these two girls got raped. There were a number of assaults and a murder actually on the campus until they finally reinstated that security. So those are the types of pieces of evidence that we can put on and show that reasonable security can make a difference. And so when you talk about can a wrongful death case with multiple defendants be successful, one of the things as a trial lawyer, especially a plaintiff's lawyer like I am, We like to have cases where there's a great deal of emotion. And, suing over money, suing over stocks, as you mentioned, the Weinstein case earlier, suing over that doesn't really give a jury the opportunity to have a verdict fueled by emotion. And even though the judge in his charges to the jury will tell them you can't have a verdict fueled by emotion and you must put aside emotion, the fact of the matter is the jury's going to hear about this case. I believe that they're going to get to a jury. I believe there's not going to be a summary judgment in favor of MGM, and probably not in favor of the companies that built the bump stocks. And I think it's going to get to a jury, and I think it could be a massive verdict, because I really think, just like Steve Wynn, who I would call as a witness, I would want to get him on the stand and say, listen, what do you have to say about the way they ran their resort and not checking these rooms? And I think he'll tell you. And my guess is that they're a highly competitive lot out there in Vegas. And my guess is Steve Wynn doesn't really care too much for MGM. And they're a competitor, and he'd like to get their business probably. So I would want to know what security is reasonable. I want to know what the other resorts do. And figure that out. I think that's going to get to a jury, and I think that's going to let them give us a verdict.
Well, hopefully they put proper safety protocols going forward. I'm confused about something. I need you to help me explain something to me.
Okay.
We know that we have this wrongful death suit that's filed by the father of this woman that was killed. We saw last week a California college student named Paige Gaspar. She was injured in the Las Vegas Music Festival. Thank goodness she was only injured. She filed a lawsuit Wednesday against the hotel owners, the concert promoter, the bump stock manufacturers, the same defendants. Right. My first question is, why has this not all been formed into a gigantic class action? And if it hasn't been formed into a class action, if she's successful, or the father, in this case, is successful, isn't anybody who files a lawsuit the same facts, it's the same situation, aren't they all going to be successful? Why is this not a class action?
Well, I think that's a great question. And so a class action generally, and many people kind of get twisted around about what a class action does, but a class action means that there is an individual who is standing and representing a number of people who have identical or substantially similar injuries, and that person can represent all of their interests. And in certain matters, obviously a personal injury or wrongful death, nobody is the same. There's no one person who can stand in the shoes and say, I'm just like Miss Gaspar, or I'm just like Miss Castilla. Nobody is the same. And so individual questions prevail. And so when a trial court decides whether an action should be treated as a class action, they call it certifying the class action, they have to find that that the questions are substantially similar and individual questions don't prevail. Obviously, individuals prevail. Nobody's got the same damages. Everybody is different. So it's not a class action. However, what we do see is that when there are a number of lawsuits filed against the same group of defendants or same defendant, and they wind up generally in federal court, there's a procedure in federal court called multi-district litigation. And multi-district litigation will take all of those lawsuits and consolidate them in one action before one federal judge, who will take and run discovery for the period of discovery. That was done, for example, in asbestos litigation. It was done in the transvaginal mesh litigation. That was done and is being done now in the opioid litigation, in which the group I'm working with, for example, represents a number of entities, and we're suing the distributors and manufacturers of opioid drugs for the increased cost of enforcement given the opioid epidemic. So you all get consolidated in one district court, even though they're all separate cases. And then while the discovery period is ongoing, the federal judge conducts discovery, rules on discovery matters, and then at the end of discovery will remand the cases to the district in which they were originally filed for trial. The truth is, most of those cases settle, so there's not necessarily always a remand. The other question that you asked me, though, was if one case wins, don't they all win? And that's a very good question. And so there's a concept, and again, it goes back and may remind you of law school again, but there's a concept of res judicata, issue preclusion, and claim preclusion. Res judicata and issue preclusion and claim preclusion essentially means that a party who was properly represented in a different action, who had the opportunity to fully litigate a question, and that question has been resolved, then it is the law for that particular party. So if it's resolved in a court of competent jurisdiction with adequate representation that MGM Resorts International had inadequate security, and that it was reasonably foreseeable that given that inadequate security that this event could happen, then it's probably done in all courts because they were fully represented. So that's a good question. If it's determined, however, that they were not liable or were not unreasonable, then that can obviously still be litigated because the new party, a different plaintiff, may have different points and different evidence.
So let me get this straight, if I make sure, just so I understand this. If it's found in one of these two cases, and maybe the other families or of the deceased, or maybe people who were injured, they could wait, hear what happens in these cases. If it's found that MGM was liable, what do they do? Do they just get a payout? How does that, I mean, how does that work in terms of that? And I do want to talk about the settlement because from what I've read, MGM doesn't want to argue this out so much in the public sphere. I think they do want to have respect for the families and for the situation and try to settle this in a way where it provides respect for everyone that was injured. Right. So I don't know if it will actually, it's possible it might not reach a jury, might not reach a trial, might be settled. But again, if MGM, as you said, if this issue is decided that they were liable, that the gun manufacturer was liable, that the estate of Stephen Paddock was liable, and even if the concert venue was liable, and we talked about the viability of all those, right, does that mean they just wait for it and accept a check, or what do they do?
Well, I mean, I don't think it's ever good for a injured party to wait. There's a statute of limitations. You have to move within 2 years and file your lawsuit. That time goes by very, very quickly, especially for grieving families. The next, you turn around and get through, all of the grieving period, and you could have lost a year and a half. And I see that all the time. People come in with a terrible story, and we're on the eve of the statute of limitations and have to move very quickly. I would think that people who have been injured, people who have lost family members, should find really good lawyers and start preparing to file a lawsuit. I do think that the more lawsuits that are filed, the increased likelihood that MGM will be willing to do something fair and reasonable to the families. What that number is, I don't know. Don't know yet. But MGM, from my viewpoint, if I represented them, I would tell them they have a massive, massive PR problem. They've got to do something with that floor. They've got to get it off the market. They've got to not ever rent that room again. I don't know what you turn it into, a memorial perhaps, I don't know. But you never rent that room again, and you do something very public to demonstrate that you're addressing the problems, because there will be more venues, there will be more concerts, they'll be obviously still renting out rooms that face it. And I don't know what the answer is. And they have obviously very highly paid PR people that can help them answer that question. But if I were representing them as their defense lawyer, and they're going to have great defense lawyers, I believe that I would tell them, we need to go ahead and start analyzing and come up with a fund that will take care of obviously every injured party's medical expenses. Yeah. Just as a PR matter, because Vegas is about PR. Vegas is about, no one else in the world comes here. Whatever you do here, you're okay. You can come here and have a great time. You're safe. And you're going to come check into our hotel because it's the best, most luxurious place. I mean, I don't know. My guess is their bookings are probably down for that hotel. And they need to do something in order to be great. And so since it's one-upmanship always in Vegas, I think they really would be well counseled to figure out how much money they can set aside for the victims, and recognizing, of course, that they're not the ones who pulled the trigger, so it's not going to be an ordinary wrongful death payout. If Paddock had all the money in the world, then there would be massive payouts from his estate. Not going to get that out of MGM Grand because they're not the trigger man. It's going to be something less than that. And I think that if we can understand how to apportion liability to some degree, that MGM could find itself being able to come out very good from a public relations standpoint, and also take care of the victims' families. Because remember, these people are mothers, their fathers, their children. They all had lives. They've left behind people who are dependent on them economically and emotionally. And unfortunately, the best thing and only thing we have in our system is money to make those reparations. And I think MGM Grand should look very hard at doing that from a PR standpoint, and just because it's right. And if they don't, then I think they can expect at least 49 wrongful death lawsuits, and I think they can expect lawsuits from every single person who's been injured, and that can be very, very consuming.
Wow. Yeah, I'm sure this is just the start of it. As you said, we won't be surprised if we see other lawsuits coming down the road. And to pinpoint, to just talk about what you said before, the idea that their sales are down. It's interesting. Right after these attacks took place, I tried to see the activity in Vegas. Were people posting on social media? What were they doing? And I guess a good thing, but also an interesting point, is that people went back to living their lives, which they took the time to pay respect to the victims, but they're also going back to the properties. They're going back and vacationing there. They're enjoying, which is, in a way, it's a good thing because it shows that won't be defeated, that you'll keep on moving forward, that we won't let these kinds of horrendous attacks stop us from living our lives. But at the same time, I think what you said was very important. It provides a wake-up call to the people operating these venues. How do we prevent anything like this from moving forward? So I think you make a great point there. I do want to talk about what you said before about this lawsuit was filed in California. This incident took place in Las Vegas. Their victims are probably from all across the country. Now, as you said before, there's a possibility if you have all these lawsuits in different states, they might combine it in federal court and see what happens. But what is the advantage, so we understand, or what's the disadvantage, or what's their thought process? Why not just file all these in Vegas? Would it be like it would just overwhelm the courts, or you file it in your separate states because that's where those injured parties are?
Sure. Well, MGM Resorts International, I believe, has its headquarters and is based in Los Angeles, California. And so this young lady's father, who lives in California as well, can file that lawsuit in California, and it will stay in the state court system of California. Because, as you know, to get federal jurisdiction in a personal injury case, there has to be what's called complete diversity of the parties. And so that means they have to be diverse from the states, but they also have to be diverse from the place the lawsuit's filed. So, for example, if somebody from Georgia were to file a lawsuit, or New York were to file a lawsuit in California, if that is indeed the home venue of MGM International, then they cannot remove the case. But if you file it in one of its other potential locations, such as Clark County, where you would have jurisdiction, then they can remove that from the Clark County, Nevada state court system into federal court, and that will put you in federal court. There's not necessarily an advantage or disadvantage. Many lawyers prefer state courts over federal courts, and depending on the state in which you find yourself, you may in fact prefer federal court over state court. I can tell you in Georgia, we like to keep our cases in a few counties, Chatham County, Clayton County, DeKalb County, and Muskogee County, because they're known as very good verdicts. If you're filing in Illinois, you want to be in Cook County, Illinois. If you're filing in Texas, you want to be in Harris County, Texas, which is Houston. There are places that are known to be, in New York, you like to be file in the Bronx. There are places where you want to be because of the known lack of bias on the judge's part and lack of bias on the juror's part. Some places are hyper conservative, where a juror wouldn't give you anything just because of the different philosophies. Certain places in Texas are bad. Certain places in Georgia, certain places in California are kind of known to be rough. Southern California is obviously a far different venue than Northern California. And you can kind of tell by the demographics. So there's not really an advantage or disadvantage. Federal court, if it's a single case, is faster. You file a case in federal court, you got to get a trial date probably in 6 months, and the federal judge will be very active in moving that case along. There are more stringent requirements about evidence, and lawyers have to work much harder in federal court. State court can tend to be a little bit more loose and lax.
Yeah, I would imagine that to be so. Mr. Tate, thank you so much for being on to talk about Las Vegas. You really provided some great insights, some great advice for the different families as well as for the defendants in this case, specifically MGM Properties, about how they can move forward. You've been a tremendous asset to help us understand what's happening with these wrongful death suits. And maybe when we have an update in this whole situation or there's a new development, we'd love to have you on to talk about it. But again, Mark Tate, thank you so much for joining us here on the Law News Network.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, there you have it.